All right. So today we're going to step away from the Industrial Revolution, the sort of broader economic and social change that's occurring in the background, and we're going to go back to where we left off before winter break, where Napoleon has just been defeated, and we're going to pick up our narrative from there and talk about what happened in Europe politically after that. So today we're going to be looking at the Congress of Vienna and the Concert of Europe. So the Congress of Vienna, that's a specific event, and then the Concert of Europe, that's sort of a system or balance of power that's established in Europe, and we're going to look at how those two things were used to maintain order in the early 19th century. Now, both of these things, the Congress of Vienna and the Concert of Europe, were sort of grounded in this philosophy called conservatism, and so we're going to look at how that political philosophy emerged, what it was, and then how it influenced foreign policy in the early 19th century. We'll also be looking later on, not today, at how it influenced domestic policy during this time. All right, so where we left off at the end of winter break, right? Napoleon has been defeated at the Battle of Waterloo, and Europe is really a mess, right? Napoleon has left a lot of destruction in his wake, a lot of change. And after his defeat, Great Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, a group known as the Quadruple Alliance, they meet in Vienna, which is the capital of Austria, and they sit down and they're like, okay, that was weird. How do we prevent that from happening again? So their goal was to restore peace and stability, and they wanted to restore not only the political order as it was before Napoleon, but they actually wanted to turn back the clock all the way to before the French Revolution, right? Because they see Napoleon as an extension of the French Revolution. So like, okay, how do we just hit the undo button and then go back to like pre-1789? You can imagine, well, we just saw a really big significant historical change here. So you can make your own predictions about how successful this is going to be. So our key figure here for today is, and actually for really the entire early 19th century, is Clemens von Metternich. And he is Austria's foreign minister. And he's a very skilled diplomat. And his whole goal is to maintain this order, maintain this peace, turn back the clock. So we'll see sort of how successful he is. All right, so there were two really big specific principles that guided Metternich and the other diplomats at the Congress of Vienna. We're going to talk about these two specific principles, and then we're going to talk about the broader underlying philosophy here. So the first principle is the principle of legitimacy. So what Metternich said was, hey, the way we can figure out who we need to put back in charge of countries is, well, who was there first? So he had this idea that they were going to restore these old, previous, legitimate monarchs back to their throne. So the best example of this actually happened a little bit before the Congress of Vienna. So it happened in that interim period where Napoleon was exiled the first time and he hadn't come back the second time. The French monarchy was actually restored to the throne. So kind of wild to me, at least. You go through this huge, massive revolution. You start with the Bourbons, they get overthrown. You end up with this military dictator, Napoleon, and then he gets overthrown. And we go all the way back to the Bourbon monarchy, right back where we started. So this happens in other places as well. However, Metternich didn't always follow this principle. So remember, his overarching purpose is to restore order and stability, right? So if he thought there were situations in which he could put someone back on the throne who hadn't actually been there in the first place, so do something new, he would do that if he thought that was actually a better way of achieving stability. So for example, there was this fight between Russia and Prussia over territory, and Metternich's like, whoa, I gotta settle this down. So what he did is he actually gave Russia a big old chunk of Poland, and he gave Prussia this German state called Saxony in order to keep them both happy. So he was maintaining stability, he was keeping the peace, but he was putting countries in charge of other countries that they hadn't previously been in charge of. So kind of upsetting the system, but he was doing that in a way to achieve stability, if that makes sense. So he would sometimes violate that principle if he thought it would maintain stability. The other really key specific principle that guided this whole process was this idea of the balance of power. And Metternich kind of negotiating between Russia and Prussia there is a really good illustration of that, actually. So what was the balance of power? Well, what Metternich wanted, he wanted to make sure that all the countries involved in this diplomatic negotiation, as well as France, right, the loser in the situation, he wanted to make sure that pretty much everybody was equally powerful. So we don't have this situation where one country gets super powerful and then just steamrolls through everybody else, right? He saw that happen with Napoleon. He did not like it. He did not think it was a good idea. So he's like, how can we make sure that there's this balance of power between Britain and Austria and Russia and Prussia and France? So what he did is he actually strengthened Prussia and Austria again as a bulwark against France, and Russia. So if you kind of picture the map here, we've got this strong state in Central Europe, this strong state in South Central Europe. We've got France on one side, we've got Russia on the other. So it's kind of geographically distributed as well. And then in addition to that, so everyone's kind of at an equal strength, all the great powers at least. Metternich established like these buffer zones of like neutral territory around France, right? You could, it's sort of like there's being a sort of like when there's a, you want to prevent fire, right? You have like a sort of fire break around. So if France is about to explode and spread fire around everywhere, now you've got like this fire break so the fire doesn't spread everywhere. And one of those states is actually going to become very important later on, and this is the new German Confederation. So we have the creation of like this new sort of neutral little buffer German state that's going to become more powerful later on when it hooks up with Prussia, or rather when Prussia hooks up with it. But yeah, so all the great powers sort of equally strong, and there's little buffer zones around France so that France doesn't try and outgrow its britches again. All right, so those are the two specific principles. Let's talk about the general underlying philosophy. And this is the idea of conservatism. You might be familiar with that word. Conservatism is a political ideology in 21st century America, but it looks a little bit different than it did in 19th century Europe. That actually really goes for all the ideologies we're going to talk about during this unit. We'll see liberalism too. That means something different in 21st century America. So if those terms mean something to you now and you follow the news, kind of set that aside for a little bit because it means something a little bit different in 19th century Europe. So conservatism is the idea that political systems and traditions and values from the past should be maintained. We shouldn't try and change things too much. Now, there's definitely kind of degrees of conservatism. So some conservatives believed that change is okay as long as it wasn't too fast. So Edmund Burke, this guy here in the picture, he was not happy with the French Revolution. He thought it was way too much, way too fast, but he didn't really object to change in general. He's like, it's fine as long as you sort of achieve it through calm parliamentary procedures. He's British, so you can kind of see where that comes from. Now, you've got those kinds of conservatives, but you've also got conservatives who are like, you know what? The only legitimate form of government is monarchy. I don't like this republic business. No, it's not good. There's no way to achieve that peacefully. I want to keep things pretty much exactly as they were before the French Revolution. All right, so let's look a little bit more closely at conservatism. So what are some specific conservative beliefs? Well, first of all, obedience to authority, right? Because again, all about stability and tradition, right? So don't want to upset things too much, right? You don't want to rebel against authority. Conservatives also really liked organized religion because, again, that's about tradition, that's about the past, right? So they really like the Catholic Church as an institution, for example, right? If you're English, maybe you like the Anglican Church as a source of order and a source of morality, right? So that was also really important to conservatives. And again, there's sort of that general idea that if you're going to change a tradition, you should be very sure that you want to change it, and you shouldn't change it through revolution at all, right? Conservatives really disliked revolution. There's, again, if you want to keep things the same, if you want to maintain tradition and order and stability, you don't come and just knock the table over, right? That's crazy. Don't do that. So not only did they dislike revolution generally as a way to achieve political change, they also didn't like the specific ideals of the French Revolution. So they're really skeptical of liberty and equality and secularism and republicanism and nationalism. Interestingly enough, today we kind of associate conservatism and nationalism, but not in the 19th century, not at all. Nationalism is a new emerging ideology. It's all about change and creating new nations. And no. Conservatives don't like the change. They're like, don't like that. We'll look a little bit more at that later today, actually. Conservatism was the dominant ideology of governments and the elite during the early 19th century. It's going to get shaken pretty hard, as you can imagine. If you suppress a revolution, sometimes that comes back. So it will come back. But for the early 19th century, conservatism is the ideology of the day. All right. So conservatism is also the underlying philosophy of the Concert of Europe. So the Congress of Vienna is this specific event where we establish this balance of power, but the Concert of Europe is going to be the system that emerges from the Concert of Vienna. So don't get those two things mixed up. Concert of Vienna comes first as one event. Concert of Europe is a system that emerges from the Congress of Vienna. And the whole purpose of the Concert of Europe, you can kind of predict it, it's all about maintaining order and the balance of power, right? So ensuring that no country gets too big for its britches and starts to try and conquer everybody else all over again, right? So the Quadruple Alliance, so Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia, and then eventually France gets to come back to the table. They get taken out of timeout. They agreed to meet at regular congresses in order to meet this goal of maintaining stability. So it's like, all right, we're going to meet every so often and just make sure that everything's cool and no one is getting all up there in anybody else's space, right? So there are revolts in Spain and Italy. So, or let me turn back the clock a little bit. So as we know, right, following the principle of legitimacy, right, we put monarchs back on the thrones that they had previously been on. So Spain and Italy both had Bourbon monarchs, so monarchs that were linked to the French monarchy, right, same royal family. They are restored. People in Spain and Italy do not like this. They're like, wait a minute, I don't like these people. I don't like Napoleon, but I'm not satisfied with these people either. So what Metternich does is he's like, oh shoot, how are we going to handle this? So he urges the consort to adopt what's called the principle of intervention. And this is an agreement to use military force to crush rebellions that threaten the conservative order, right? So he's like, how are we going to maintain this stability, right? Well, if a country decides that they're going to have a revolution, we go in there and we smack it down. We do not like this, right? Now, Great Britain was not really on board with that, interestingly enough. They're like, wait a minute, I don't like that we could just go in and smash other countries' government. And everyone looks at Britain, they're like, Britain, you're like the primary colonial power right now. You love to go in and smash people's government. Well, Britain did not reject the principle of intervention because they just didn't like getting involved in people's government. They often had ulterior motives for rejecting this principle, as we will find out. All right, so the really biggest example of a fight over the principle of intervention is Latin America. So just to kind of turn back the clock a little bit, as you remember, at the beginning of the 19th century, so prior to Napoleon, South and Central America are under the control of Spain and Portugal. So those countries colonized them. They are still their colonial overlords. But when Napoleon rolls through Europe and he overthrows the Spanish government, he overthrows the Portuguese government, and he installs his family members as their rulers, this obviously causes a lot of chaos back in Spain and Portugal. So Spain and Portugal are preoccupied with what's happening at home, and they're not really maintaining a lot of control over their colonies, right? So that's happening. And then secondly, those Enlightenment ideals that led to revolt in America and in France, they don't just stop there. They spread. People love them. So they spread to South and Central America, and we get leaders like Simón de Bolívar and José de San Martín, and they're like, hey, I want to be free. Let's have a revolt. And so they stage revolts against Spain. They say South and Central America should become independent. Now, what does Europe do? Well, they're divided. Austria, Prussia, and Russia are like, ooh, I don't like these Enlightenment ideals spreading. I don't like revolution. I don't like people trying to become independent. This is not good. England, on the other hand, is like, no. Let's just let this play out how it will. They do not want to intervene. And you're like, well, why is this? Did they learn from the American Revolution? It's not great to go around suppressing other people's revolutions. Not really. They didn't really value Latin America's freedom or anything like that either. Really, they're like, well, if Latin America becomes politically independent from Spain and Portugal, well, that gives us a little inroad. Let's use them for economic imperialism. So we won't take over their governments, but we will take over their economies. We'll use them as a source of raw materials, and then we'll use them as a market to sell our manufactured goods. So we kind of saw this happen a little bit earlier with India, right? Basically, England is like, haha, I see another opening. Let's make Latin America another England. Now, so what happens is Austria, Prussia, and Russia, they realize, well, England has a navy. We don't have as strong a navy. England can go sail their boats over to Latin America. And if we try and challenge them with our dinky little boats, that will not go well. So they back off. And that is sort of a hit to the principle of intervention. Now, another part of the principle of intervention, the alliance was actually willing to forego the principle of intervention and get involved in other countries' revolutions and support revolutions, weirdly enough, if they believed it would protect their conservative interests. Counterintuitive as that might seem, we'll actually see this happen a lot. This happens a lot during the Cold War, for example. A country will be like, we don't like revolutions, and then they'll get involved if they think the revolutions will be good for them. So yeah, great hypocrisy there. So for example, the Greek revolt, so the alliance, so Quadruple Alliance in France, backs a revolt by the Greeks against the Ottoman Empire. So Ottoman Empire, like modern day Turkey, right? We haven't talked about them in a while. And the reason why they did this is they believed that supporting the Greeks would weaken the Ottoman Empire. They wanted to do a big hit to the Ottoman Empire. Even though the Greeks are staging like this nationalist revolt, and you're like, wait, nationalism, a revolt? Conservatives don't like that. They're like, well, kind of that's the lesser of two evils here. If we support them, we hit the Ottomans, and that's good for us. Well, why is that good for us? Ottoman Empire is Muslim. Greeks, Christian. Austria, Prussia, Russia, Great Britain, France, Christian. You can see where that's coming from now. And then, of course, the Ottoman Empire is pretty powerful, so they worried that they believed that dealing a hit to that country would be in Europe's best interests.